Welcome to the University of New Hampshire's Latin Grammar Minute. I'm Professor Scott Smith, and today we'll be forming the present tense active of first and second conjugation verbs. Remember, Latin is an inflected language, which means that the endings tell you the relationship of words to each other in a sentence. And for verbs, the endings will tell you various things, such as the tense, present, imperfect, future, perfect, and so on. But for right now, all we want to focus on is who is doing the action. So we divide up the endings into first, second, and third person, singular and plural. That is I, first person singular, we, first person plural, you, second person singular, you plural, second person plural, third person singular, he, she, or it, and then third person plural, which is they. Now the endings that correspond to these translations are first person singular, O and M. Notice the O is long. Second person singular is S. Third person singular is T. First person plural is MUS or mus. Second person plural is TIS or tis. And third person plural is NT. Now, when we actually add these endings to verbs, right, we have to actually be able to determine to what stem or onto what stem we should put them. And for the present tense active, which is what we're focusing on today, that is simple present. For example, I go, he hits, she holds, they listen. For this, all you need are the first two principal parts of the four principal parts that you learned for each verb. So, for example, erro, errare, those two forms will allow you to form the present tense active. Same thing for second conjugation verbs. For example, video, videre, these are the only two forms you need to form the present tense active. So let's take those and take a closer look at those. Right? Let's look at the second principal part, which is, of course, the present active infinitive, to do something. So errare means to make a mistake. Videre means to see. Now, finding the present stem, that is the stem onto which you will put those endings we started this lecture with, right, requires us to do some changes to the infinitive. Okay, so first, if you look at the ending, RE is the infinitive ending. If you drop those off, you will have the present stem. So if you drop off the RE off of errare, you will have era. Right? If you drop off the RE off of videre, you have vide. Now, for all intents and purposes, these forms we will call the present stem. But what's really going on is that the stem is E-R-R, and then you have the conjugation vowel long A. Same thing with videre. The stem is vid, and the conjugation vowel is a long E. But for right now, it's easier just to remember that era and vide, for your intents and purposes, is going to be the present stem. So, how do we form the present from this present stem? Well, you add those endings onto the stem. The only difference in the first conjugation, or the only thing you have to remember about this, is that the long A does not show up in the first person singular. So instead of having errao, you have erro. But if you look at all the other forms, you'll notice that they simply are attached to that stem, era. So you have erro, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. And these are all first conjugation verbs, forms because we have the long A in the infinitive, are. Now let's take a closer look at some of the things that you have to remember about this. Remember, we expect to have an A in all of the forms. First conjugation verbs have a long A. But in the first person singular, the O sound has swallowed the A. So instead of erao, we have ero. The second thing to remember is that final T and final NT make normally long vowels short. So in the case of the third person singular and the third person plural, you see you have a final T, that is a T that ends the word, or final NT, that is the NT ends the word, that before that the long A becomes short. Right? Now remember, if you really want to know Latin 100%, you need to pay attention to the quantity of these vowels. Right? So it's ero, eras, erat. Eramus, eratis, erant. But make sure that you learn the macrons, right? The long marks, the vowels that are naturally long as you learn the form. Good. So let's take a look at the second conjugation, eire. And our practice verb is video, which means to see. So you have video, wides, widet, widemus, widatus, wident. Again, in this case, we have in the first person singular the vowel we expect, E, right? Video. Now look at the quantity of that E though, right? It's short. What happens in Latin is if you have two vowels that are right next to each other, even if they're both long, the first vowel tends and almost always becomes short. So instead of video, it's wideo. The accent's on the I, wideo. Likewise, remember the third person singular and the third person plural have a final T and a final NT, so the long E becomes short. All right, again, remember these as you write out your paradigms, the forms. Now, how do we translate these verbs? So for example, if you have video, how do you translate it? Well, you can do that in a number of different ways. So for example, we have the simple present, I see, or I praise, or I hope. That is action simply stated in the present tense. Now we also have in English, not in Latin, in English we have a different set of forms for what we call the present progressive. That is when someone is in the progress of doing something, when the action is envisioned as ongoing in the present tense. And so in this case we would translate it, you are seeing, she is hoping, I am praising. Right? Now in Latin, the simple present, the forms we just learned, does both the simple present and the simple progressive. In other words, Latin doesn't have multiple present tenses like English does. Now when you're translating a Latin sentence, what that means is you have to basically translate it as it sounds most natural in English. We'll get back to that later. There's also a third way to translate the present tense in Latin, and that is with the emphatic present. I do praise. We oftentimes will not use this form as a statement, but we almost always use it when we're making a question. So, do I praise? Do they see? So you want to remember all three of these as a way to translate the present tense of Latin. Now, let's go over a couple more forms from the present stem, and these are the imperatives. Imperatives are simply commands, and in Latin, the imperative forms that you're learning are always essentially second persons. You're always addressing someone and telling them to do something. But in English, we don't use a pronoun, right? All we do is use the verbal form. So, for example, give me the book. Right? Give is an imperative. Tell me a story. Tell is an imperative. Help me. Help is an imperative. Now in Latin, these imperatives are relatively easy to form. In fact, if you just take off the RE off of the infinitive, at least for the first and second conjugation, you have the present imperative. So for example, if you take the verb tenere, to hold, if you drop off the RE, you have tene, hold, the imperative. Now if you want to make these imperatives plural, all you do is you add a te to the end of it. So tenete, you're talking to more than one person, but you translate the same way, hold. Likewise, for first conjugation verbs, laudare, to praise. If you drop off the re, you have simply lauda, which means praise, as an imperative. Make it plural, simply add a te, and in this case, it's the same translation. Praise, praise me, but it's talking to more than one person. So let's have some practice. At this point, I encourage you, after I give you the meanings of the verbs on the left-hand side, to pause the video and try and translate the forms that you see on the right-hand side. So the practice verbs are monere, second conjugation, to warn, amare, first conjugation, to love, laudare, to praise, first conjugation, and tenere, to hold, second conjugation. So pause the video now and see what you can do with the forms on the right-hand side. All right, let's take a look at the answers. So mones, mones. The S tells you at the end of the word that it's second person singular, so you blank. So mones is translated as you warn or you are warning. Next, tenant. The NT tells you that it's third person plural. Therefore, they. So they hold, they are holding. Next, amas, amas. Again, we have the S at the end of the word, but this time it's attached to a first conjugation verb, ama, which means love. So amas means you love or you are loving. Next, laudamus, which means we praise. Mus tells you it's first person plural. Laudatis, second person plural. Tis at the end of the word tells you it's you plural. So laudatis means you plural are praising or you praise. The next form is not a finite verb. It doesn't have a pronoun attached to it. It is simply an imperative, mone, mone, which means warn, and it's singular, so you're only talking to one person. Next, amat, amat. The T shows you it's he, she, or it, third person singular, so he, she, or it loves. Next, tenatus, tenatus, second person plural, you hold, you are holding, you do hold. Next, we threw you a curveball. Laudare is simply the infinitive form. It means to praise. And last, amate, amate, it means love. It's a plural imperative, and you're commanding a bunch of people to love something. Let's practice some more. Here, instead of going from Latin to English, we're going from English to Latin, which takes a little bit more thought process to do it. We're changing the verbs, so vedere, to see, vocare, to call, cogitare, to think, and errare, to make a mistake. Again, we encourage you to pause the video at this point and do some practice. We will not go over the words, we will simply show them to you and you can correct your work at your leisure. And that ends the University of New Hampshire Latin Grammar Minute on first and second conjugation verbs, present tense.